The Requiem Mass is notable for the large number of musical compositions that it has inspired, including settings by Mozart, Verdi, Dvořák, Fauré and Duruflé. Originally, such compositions were meant to be performed in liturgical service with monophonic chant. Eventually, the dramatic character of the text began to appeal to composers to an extent that they made the Requiem a genre of its own, and the compositions of composers such as Verdi are essentially concert pieces rather than liturgical works. Common texts. The following are the texts that have been set to music. Note that the Libero Me and the In Paradisum are not part of the text of the Catholic Mass for the dead itself, but part of the burial rite that immediately follows. In Paradisum was traditionally said or sung as the body left the church, and the Libero Me is said, sung at the burial site before interment. These became included in musical settings of the Requiem in the 19th century as composers began to treat the form more liberally. Introit Kyrie eleison. This is as a Kyrie in the ordinary of the Mass. This is Greek. Each utterance is sung 3 times, though sometimes that is not the case when sung polyphonically. Gradual tract sequence. A sequence is a liturgical poem sung, when used, after the tract. The sequence employed in the Requiem, Dies Irae, attributed to Thomas of Celano, has been called the greatest of hymns, worthy of supreme admiration. The Latin text below is taken from the Requiem Mass in the 1962 Roman Missal. The first English version below, translated by William Josiah Irons in 1849, replicates the rhyme and meter of the original. The second English version is a more formal equivalence. Offertory Sanctus. This is as the Sanctus Prayer in the ordinary of the Mass, Agnus Dei. This is as the Agnus Dei in the ordinary of the Mass, but with the petitions Miserere Nobis changed to Dona Ris Requiem, and Dona Nobis Pacem to Dona Ris Requiem Sempiternum. Communion as mentioned above. There is no Gloria Alleluia or Credo in these musical settings. Pi Jesu. Some extracts too have been set independently to music, such as Pi Iesu in the settings of Dvořák, Fauré, Duruflé and John Rutter. The Pi Jesu consists of the final words of the Dies Irae followed by the final words of the Agnus Dei. Musical Requiem settings sometimes include passages from the Absolution at the bier or commendation of the dead person, which in the case of a funeral follows the conclusion of the Mass. Libero Me in Paradisum. History of musical compositions. For many centuries the texts of the Requiem were sung to Gregorian melodies. The Requiem by Johannes Ockham, written sometime in the later half of the 15th century, is the earliest surviving polyphonic setting. There was a setting by the elder composer Dufay, possibly earlier, which is now lost. Ockham's may have been modeled on it. Many early compositions employ different texts that were in use in different liturgies around Europe before the Council of Trent set down the texts given above. The Requiem of Brummel, circa 1500, is the first to include the Dies Irae. In the early polyphonic settings of the Requiem, there is considerable textual contrast within the compositions themselves. Simple chordal or Fosbourn-like passages are contrasted with other sections of contrapuntal complexity, such as in the offertory of Ockham's Requiem. In the 16th century, more and more composers set the Requiem Mass, in contrast to practice in setting the Mass ordinary. Many of these settings used a cantus firmus technique, something which had become quite archaic by mid-century. In addition, these settings used less textual contrast than the early settings by Ockham and Brummel, although the vocal scoring was often richer. For example, in the six-voice Requiem by Jean Richard Fit, which he wrote for the death of Josquin des Prez. Other composers before 1550 include Pedro de Escobar, Antoine de Favon, Cristobal Morales, and Pierre de la Rue. That by la Rue is probably the second oldest composed after requiems. Over 2,000 requiem compositions have been composed of the present day, typically the Renaissance settings, especially those not written on the Iberian Peninsula, may be performed a cappella, whereas beginning around 1600 composers more often preferred to use instruments to accompany a choir, and also include vocal soloists. There is great variation between compositions in how much of liturgical text is set to music. Most composers omit sections of the liturgical prescription, most frequently the gradual and the tract. Fauré omits the dies irae, while the very same text had often been set by French composers in previous centuries as a stand-alone work. Sometimes composers divide an item of the liturgical text into two or more movements because of the length of its text. The dies irae is the most frequently divided section of the text, the introit and Kyrie being immediately adjacent in the actual Roman Catholic liturgy, are often composed as one movement. Musico-thematic relationships among movements within a requiem can be found as well. Requiem in concert, beginning in the 18th century and continuing through the 19th, many composers wrote what are effectively concert works, which by virtue of employing forces too large, or lasting such a considerable duration, prevent them being readily used in an ordinary funeral service. The requiems of Dvořák, Berlioz, Verdi, and Dvořák are essentially dramatic concert oratorios. A counter-reaction to this tendency came from the Sicilian movement, which recommended restrained accompaniment for liturgical music, and frowned upon the use of operatic vocal soloists. Notable compositions. Many composers have composed requiems. Some of the most notable include the following. Ockham Requiem, the earliest to survive, written sometime in the mid to late 15th century. Victoria Requiem of 1603. Jan Dismas-Zelenka Requiem in D minor ZWV 48 after Augustus the Strong circa 1730. Mozart Requiem in D minor K 626. Antonio Salieri Requiem, Cherubini Requiem in C minor. Berlioz, Grande Messe des Morts. Brahms, a German Requiem, Opus 45, based on passages from Luther's Bible. Verdi Requiem, Dvořák Requiem, Op. 89. Fauré Requiem in D minor, Op. 48. Duruflé Requiem, Opus 9, based almost exclusively on the chants from the Gradual Romanum. Britain, War Requiem, Opus 66, which incorporated poems by Wilfred Owen. Stravinsky, Requiem Canticles. Penderecki, Polish Requiem. Lloyd Webber, Requiem. Rutter Requiem, includes Psalm chapter 130, Psalm chapter 23 and words from the Book of Common Prayer. See also, category Requiems. Other composers. Modern treatments. In the 20th century the requiem evolved in several new directions. The genre of war requiem is perhaps the most notable. It consists of compositions dedicated to the memory of people killed in wartime. These often include extra-liturgical poems of a pacifist and non-liturgical nature. For example, the War Requiem of Benjamin Britten juxtaposes the Latin text with the poetry of Wilfred Owen. Krzysztof Penderecki's Polish Requiem includes a traditional Polish hymn within the sequence, and Robert Stedman's Mass in Black intersperses environmental poetry and prophecies of Nostradamus. Holocaust Requiem may be regarded as a specific subset of this type. The World Requiem of John Folds was written in the aftermath of the First World War and initiated the Royal British Legion's annual Festival of Remembrance. Recent requiem works by Taiwanese composers Tyson Shao and Fan Longko follow in this tradition, honoring victims of the February 28 incident and subsequent White Terror. Lastly, the 20th century saw the development of the secular requiem, written for public performance without specific religious observance. such as Frederick Delius's Requiem, completed in 1916 and dedicated to a memory of all young artists fallen in the war, and Dmitri Kabalevsky's Requiem, a setting of a poem written by Robert Stravinsky especially for the composition. Herbert Howells's unaccompanied Requiem uses Psalm chapter 23, Psalm chapter 121, Salvator Mundi, Requiem Aeternam, and I Heard a Voice from Heaven. Quote, some composers have written purely instrumental works bearing the title of Requiem, as famously exemplified by Britain's Sinfonia da Requiem. Hans Werner Henze's Das Floss der Medusa, written in 1968 as a Requiem for Che Guevara, is properly speaking an oratorio. Henze's Requiem is instrumental but retains the traditional Latin titles for the movements. Igor Stravinsky's Requiem Canticles mixes instrumental movements with segments of the introit, Dies irae, Pi Jesu, and Libera me.